What is going on, you guys? Welcome back to the channel. Hope you're having a great day, morning, noon, night, whatever it is for you guys. Hope you're having the best day possible. So today, guys, we're going to be hopping right back on into some Star Wars versus Warhammer Brothers Lost, episode 4. Now, in the last episode, we left on kind of a cliffhanger, you guys. The clone captain decided that it was a smart idea to take the hyperdrive safety off and just crank that bad boy on up and send it through the other ship. Now, Hobbit, thank you for leaving the information down in the comments that apparently the ship I'm thinking of, the Phalanx, is not the ship that came through the warp portal. Ugh, can't talk. But it was actually just a regular sized ship from one of the fleets, and that it is still that much bigger than anything that the Star Wars universe has to offer. And that kind of blew my mind, because if it was the Phalanx, then they would stand no chance at all. But it's just kind of crazy that a regular ship takes up that much of the viewfinder that is just so much larger. All right, guys, let's jump right on into this Star Wars versus Warhammer episode 4. Brothers Lost. Ready? All right, guys, let's get into this. Brothers Lost. Ready? Now, this video is not monetized, you guys, so go check out A Fan With Too Much Time. We'll link his channel down in the description for you. And we've also created a subreddit, so go check that out too. Bam, ba, 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 ba. The Battle of System Case 749.
No forgiveness, no retreat.
Never. No
Renfai
forgiveness.
was yelling as though his voice could reach the clone captain. Dr. Sheena felt a strange pang echo within her as she watched, her eyes fixed to the sensor readings as Captain Kraken's Venator briefly paused and oriented itself in an all-too-familiar way. She saw the sensors register a sudden spike in power levels, and then, as another reading streaked across the screen, her eyes snapped up in open disbelief. Chrono radiation. "Captain!" the Jedi called one last time, panic riddling his voice like maggots in rotten meat.
He don't hear you.
It was over in an instant. A terrible, shining instant. Renfai's wide jaws gaped suddenly as he gave voice to an inhuman scream, a reptilian sound of teeth and tongue and throaty horror which reverberated in the air.
Yes.
Dr. Sheena felt it as well, felt the cold, sickly panic rising within her, the realization that something terrible and permanent had just transpired before her own eyes.
Yeah, he
The
ain't
knight
coming back.
collapsed, overwhelmed, his claws grasping his broad head as if to hold it together as bloodshot streaks painted the yellows around his corneas, and thick veins of drool ran between his peg-like teeth in uncontrolled rivulets. And yet, Dr. Sheena empathized with the Trandoshan then, more than at any other time. A hyperspace ram. Illegal under Republic law, illegal under Separatist law. Even the huts forbade such unthinkable use of hyperdrive technology. Even the old Sith knew enough about the danger of that kind of trend to avoid it whenever possible.
Yeah.
And Captain Kraken had just broken a million laws across the breadth of known space to kill the flagship of a potential enemy. A potential enemy.
He's dead.
Dr.
So
Sheena liked to think of herself as heavily pragmatic. She was fast to know what should be done, even in the face of petty moral considerations and cultural aesthetics. Logic was ruthless, and she liked to think of herself as an acolyte of logic. But this was madness on a level she could never have expected and would never have recommended. The outsider ship had been hundreds of times more massive than the Venator that had been smashed into it, but clearly it had not been shielded, nor even as armored as a ship of that size should have been. The entire front end of the massive vessel was blown open.
yeah, guys. So, could you imagine like an asteroid coming from outer space, like the size of a baseball, or maybe a basketball, something in that range, and the impact that would leave on the Earth? Now imagine a space cruiser ramming into another space cruiser. I don't think anybody is gonna come back from that one. So yeah, I don't think he cares about all the laws that he broke, because he did.
And curling away like a junker artist's rendition of a flower made from a steel can. Blue and white scars of superheated metal glowed like filigree across every scar, every rent and tear. Rescue, Renfai muttered, still on the floor. Sir? Asked one of the clones, the captain of the ship. Rescue! Renfai yelled, rising to his feet unnaturally, deck plates bending from the force of whatever energy field he had used to lift himself. All Venators, all KDY vessels, move in towards the outsider ship. Commence emergency rescue operations. Save as many as you can. Yes, General, called the captain of the ship, and the clones manning the communication systems got to work relaying his orders. Dr. Sheena said nothing. After all, what could she say? She couldn't even pull her eyes away from the cloud of metallic debris forming around the carcass of the vessel. Distantly, she was impressed by the ruggedness of the vessel's engines, still burning, turning the ship in a sputtering, slow spiral, despite its structure having been disemboweled. She didn't want to think about it. Wanted to look away from the glowing metal, away from the encroaching Venators surrounding the ship.
It's like a car crash, guys. You know, you're trying to go past. You're like, can we just go, guys? It's a car crash. But everybody has got to stop and look. They can't take their eyes away from it. They just can't.
Away from the cloud of debris. But too much of that debris was squirming. Too much of it was shaped like... Finally, her eyes broke from the scene as she threw up onto the floor. It wasn't much. Her breakfast had been light, and so she had recovered when the sensors operator next to her called out his next observation. More anomalies, sir! How many? How far?
A lot.
Renfai almost groaned. Near our edge of the system, General. Current readings showed 20. 1 moment, sir. The sensor operator began checking his equipment, and Dr. Sheena, still standing nearby, couldn't help but turn back to look at his console screen. Her eyes bulged. Withdraw the fleet!
I don't know.
She gasped. More are still appearing. A transmission is being detected, being sent out from the downed dreadnought. Intercept that transmission. Continue the rescue operation. Yes, General. Are you listening to me? Dr. Sheena shouted.
No.
I heard you, Doctor, Renfai said. And? She insisted. And I believe the outsiders will see that we are trying to rescue their people and will not open fire on us in the midst of that. That's not a given! They could just as easily blame us for its current... Transmission intercepted, sir.
Yeah.
Play it, Renfai ordered. The clone obeyed, playing the message over the speakers. It was a man, or at least it sounded like one. He, or it, was almost shouting, his voice rich with panic and zeal of a kind that sent shivers down Dr. Sheena's spine. The language was alien, guttural, and yet not nearly as alien as the Doctor would have thought from an extragalactic species.
Get the protocol droid working on deciphering that,
Renfai ordered. Yes, sir.
Update me on the anomalies,
The Jedi said. Right. Sir, you're not going to believe this.
Speak, trooper.
What?
I'm counting well over 200 vessels, General.
Then we still outnumber them. The KDY fleet is massive. Well over 1,000 ships to discourage an attack.
Sir, the smallest vessel in their fleet is 2 kilometers long. The largest I'm seeing is 12, maybe 13 kilometers long. And it's not just 1 or 2. I'm detecting 6, no, more of such vessels. General, they are accelerating.
Open hailing frequencies. Try to contact them.
The clone nodded, strapping on a thick communications headset as he began to scan frequencies for active use. Stop this! Look at that fleet! We can't fight off that many dreadnoughts! We have none of our own! Everything in that outsider armada dwarfs us by...
Doctor, I can appreciate how stressful this must be for you. But this is now an active operation. If you cannot control yourself, then I encourage you to return to the laboratory.
But are you mad? Look at how large their ships are!
Strength does not come from size alone.
This is no time for your philosophical moralizing. That fleet is going to eat us alive if we aren't gone before they close with us. Stop acting like a peacemaker and start acting like a commander.
Enough!
You gotta get out
Snapper,
of here.
clear. Please escort the doctor back to the laboratory. Stand guard outside and make sure the science staff stays safe.
Aye, General. Come on, miss. One coaxed as both came along either side of Dr. Sheena, clearly intending to seize her by the arms if she did not comply willingly. Dr. Sheena scowled, but would not surrender her dignity to the Jedi, turning without a word and walking towards the lift which would take her back down towards the other members of her team. But before she left, she bore witness to the following exchange, an exchange that ensured she would be dragged out of the room, screaming to all the ship that Renfai was a fool. She bore witness to the next translated message and final actions of the gutted dreadnought. The sight and sound of it would mark her for the rest of her breaths. Sir, we've got another transmission going out from the damaged dreadnought.
Is that translation complete?
Aye, sir. TC4 on the Statesman has completed a translation matrix, applying it now. They all waited for a few seconds, all but Dr. Sheena and her escort, who moved slowly but steadily towards the doors, both the clones and the doctor being more than slightly curious in hearing what the split vessel was trying to transmit. They didn't have to wait long, as the frenzied voice of the ship's captain blared over the comm speakers.
So did they survive on the Dreadnought?
Everyone was stunned, shocked, horrified. The outsider dreadnought had just exploded, its hull already a glowing wreck from the unexpected and unbelievable hyperspace ramming maneuver Captain Kraken had just performed tens of minutes ago. And as destructive as that had been, this was somehow even worse. The massive, rent vessel had appeared to darken and then blossom outward with silent, radiant light. Spikes had been wearing his helmet, a habit he maintained even in his new role as captain of his own Venator-class Star Destroyer. The lenses darkened to shield him from the sudden flash, but most of his bridge crew were not so lucky. Either blinded or gawking, they watched as the explosion began to spread out, sweeping through the Venators and KDY vessels that had positioned themselves around the dreadnought. "Full reverse!" he called.
Better get out of there fast.
That was understandable. What they were seeing was rather shocking. But Spikes was dead to novelty and unimpressed by power. He drew his blaster pistol and fired it into the floor, the sound and heat jolting his crew back from the oblivion of disbelief. "Full reverse!" he repeated, and the clone crew scrambled to obey. Spikes had earned his name at the Battle of Jabim. He lost all his pod brothers in that fight, and had been separated behind enemy lines when the nationalists of the muddy hellscape had overwhelmed Shelter Base. Alone, standing atop a rapidly sinking pile composed of the burnt bodies of his brothers, he had held for 3 days. 3 days.
Long
They
days.
came at him every hour, on the hour, for 3 days. He used all his power packs, all his brothers' power packs, all their thermal detonators, all of their equipment that wasn't sucked into the planet's muddy maw. With every assault, the Separatists would lose more men, and after every assault, he survived. Eventually he was rescued by the Padawan pack led by Anakin Skywalker, and was named after an intercepted transmission sent by the Nationalists just prior to his retrieval.
Avoid the southern descent. Single enemy position. No strategic importance. Assault will bleed you. The position has spikes.
The term had been common military slang among the Nationalists of Jabim to refer to a heavily entrenched enemy position, one which could not be taken without heavy losses. Spikes had taken the name like a wounded soldier takes a medal of honor, and he had carried that experience throughout the entire war, and it had served him well many times, and this was no different. His Venator, the Trusted Victory, didn't even turn, all retro thrusters firing in full reverse, sliding the wedge-shaped ship backwards. He watched as other Venators, more of which were sliding into view of his bridge as his own vessel continued to reverse course, were slower to react.
Are they
Many
gonna
did
get
nothing.
out?
A few didn't even cut their forward engines, and of those that did begin to take decisive action, most tried to spin their Venator around, wasting precious time. When the rolling wave of the scorching blue and purple energy reached them, it rocked the ship like an asteroid collision, sending the Star Destroyer tumbling and turning through the void like a kite caught in a hurricane. Systems flickered, alarms sounded, gravity died, and then it passed. "Damage report," Spikes called, sitting in one of the comm officer's chairs, having strapped himself down mere moments before the impact. The replies were sluggish at first, but soon the clones snapped back to their instincts, lifting off fluctuating systems, damaged components, and resequencing protocols. The ship was battered, but far from dead, and soon gravity reasserted itself as all main systems came back online. And that was good, because there was no time to lose. "I need the current status of the enemy ships," Spikes said. "It's just over 200 ships, all closing with the fleet. They're opening fire!" Spikes unstrapped himself, jogging to the massive holo-display at the center of the bridge. "Show me!" Spikes ordered. The holo-table flicked to life, showing the disarrayed elements of the KDY defense fleet, already partially devoured by the explosion caused by the dreadnought. It also displayed the outsider fleet, numerically smaller than their own armada, and yet so much more. All of their ships were massive, but they had appeared at a great distance compared to their initial dreadnought, and Spikes concluded their opening salvos to be more a show of force and fervor than an effective attack. He quickly realized his error when the Courage and the Coruscanti Honor, two fellow Venators that were drifting nearby, were suddenly struck by pillars of crimson light. The beams were almost as wide as the Star Destroyers themselves, and while the shields seemed to hold for a moment, they quickly collapsed. Spikes was dead to novelty.
So is that, excuse me, is that a plasma lance that is being used upon them on those two ships? If it's, or is it some other weapon? I don't know. Somebody let me know.
Was unimpressed by power, but even he nearly paused as he watched the two sister ships melt like candles under the crimson touch of the outsider weapons. Nearly. "Angle the ship to face the enemy fleet. Lower our profile," he called, and his crew responded with practiced efficiency. And not a moment too soon, as a similar pillar of red streaked past their starboard side, skimming the shields and scorching the plating. But it was just a scratch, a scathing hit, a small thing carrying a large lesson which Spikes took to heart.
Stay out the way.
Contact all surviving Venators in our area. Tell them to drive for the destroyed dreadnought. Tell them to use the debris and the skeleton of the ship as cover. We will lead the way. His orders were carried out, and even parroted by other canny officers of the Republic Navy, and soon he and 8 other Venators were cruising full thrust for the drifting white-hot wreckage of the explosion that they had just barely escaped. Already he knew turbo lasers would be ineffective at this range, far slower than the truly light-based energy weapons that were being fired at them from so many thousands of miles away. "Sir, shouldn't we close with them? Get into effective weapons range?" "No need. They're coming to us. We need to survive their salvos until we can engage with our turbo lasers."
We're gonna hide first.
"Get me in contact with the ships around us. Let's link up into a fleet grouping. I've got the start of an idea." His orders carried out. Soon, the Trusted Victory and 8 other Venator Star Destroyers were flying in formation, having nearly reached the debris of the massive ship corpse. Checking the sensors on the holotable, Spikes could see the fragmented response of the Armada taking form. He was not receiving any orders or directive from the Jedi General in charge of the operation, so he assumed no one was. Half the surviving fleet was forming up around Renfi's flagship, the Honor Hound. A quarter were charging the enemy fleet, mostly made up of dedicated, non-clone crewed KDY ships.
Not smart.
Even that quarter matched the actual number of the charging ships, but they looked like a cloud of fleas charging a pack of Rancors, and Spikes did not expect them to do much but slow them down. Then, 2 more ships near him were struck. This time they weren't sitting ducks, however, and instead of burning through the shields and ships with persistent pillars of light, as had happened before, this time the beams strafed the surface of both ships, veering off their hulls after only a second or 2 of contact. The captain of the Ever-True, one of the struck ships, appeared on the holotable. "Captain Spikes," he said. "Captain Touchy, what's the situation on your ship?" "Well, shields are almost out, and it just got a lot hotter in here, but we seem to be doing all right. Having our sides to them helped reduce the area of contact, but I'm not using that port hangar exit anytime soon. I think they're using some kind of composite laser weapon to attack us from this range." "Captain, the Republic's glory is drifting out of formation," called a trooper. Before Spikes could even ask for it, an image of the stricken Venator was displayed for him, still mostly intact, save for the 2 bridges located at the top of the ship, both smoldering with molten metal. Already escape pods and fighter craft were launching from it, while its engines, mindless and rudderless, continued to burn at full thrust, gradually veering away from the group. Spikes thought it would surely collide with the debris they were aiming towards, but he was wrong. A second strafing pillar of red waved across it, and then a third firing between the formation, hitting nothing. But the one additional impact was all the Republic's glory could take, and its hull was sheared away, a quarter of the ship departing on its own momentum while the mostly intact remnant of the Star Destroyer spun wildly, its damaged engines twirling it through space before it terminated 48 seconds later with an explosion. Spikes considered retreating then, and decided that even if he did ultimately do so, he would not leave before drawing blood for the Republic. Soon, he and the 7 surviving Venators were among the debris, and no more fire came towards them.
Why?
For it seemed the enemy knew that their light-based weapons would be rendered vastly weaker if they fired them through the particles and lumps of the debris field. Yet clearly they were not forgotten, for it was easy to see that an entire squadron of the smaller, yet still large craft had peeled away from the main charging force to address them. As they waited, Spikes set about arranging the ships, watching the enemy approach, and finally biding his time. As he did, he redirected his attention briefly to the battle being waged by the KDY assault and the encroaching battle fleet. He blinked. They were gone. Almost all
decimated.
Gone. The enemy ships had not slowed down, did not take firing positions or angles of attack in any conventional sense as the KDY ships had. They merely plowed through them, never halting, never stopping, literally ramming their way through the enemy in suicidal charges that saw ships 2 kilometers long colliding with the smaller vessels of the KDY Starfleet. And yet, they were not suicidal charges. Even as the KDY vessels began their haphazard assault on the faster leading ships of the enemy armada, even as they rained turbo lasers and concussion missiles upon them, the ships did not stop, and they did not break, not one. Upon getting a cleaner image of the ships, he realized why. They had prows, giant armored prows. Most of their guns seemed paradoxically to be mounted as broadsides, as on an archaic ocean transport, with only the occasional long weapons battery or two slung under the prow or over the port or starboard shoulders of the ships. And as proton torpedoes impacted onto those massive wedge-like heads, as they were beaten by turbo lasers and concussion missiles and ship hull alike, they dented, burned, sizzled, melted, and were still too thick to overcome. Those few KDY vessels who evaded the charging nose.
So guys, I really don't feel like the Star Wars fleet has any chance of surviving this, unless the Warhammer people just back off, which I don't think they're gonna do that at all.
Noses of the outsiders were torn to ribbons in the cascading broadsides they let loose as they passed. The guns were so large, massive. Where a Republic vessel of that size could carry 40 or more weapons batteries intended for ship-to-ship combat, some of these vessels had as little as 10, some perhaps less. And yet, to call the ships lightly armed would be more than an understatement.
Mistaken.
It would be a lie. The guns were larger than many of the KDY's whole starships, dwarfing freighters, light frigates, and all starfighters deployed against the ships which bore them. Watching the red pings of the enemy meet the blue pings of their own fleet, and then watching all the blue vanish like snuffed candles, was making him sick. "We can't just sit here, sir," one of the men, the helmsman, said. "They need our help. We could flank them from here. We could charge," and Spikes did not speak. He was too afraid of what his voice might come out as, but instead, he shook his head, cutting the clone off.
What?
"Batter. You know we can't," he managed after a moment. "We will be cut to pieces by those broadsides. Besides, those larger ships are still hanging back,
They're back
waiting
there
for us to break cover so they can do to us what they did to the Republic's glory. There's a whole group of them coming for us anyway. We won't have to go to them. We need to stick to the plan." And even then, as Spikes watched the red pings headed in their direction grow closer and closer, he knew that even with his plan, there was no certainty. "Launch all starfighters," he ordered. Barely a minute after that order was given, the red pings had become visible ships. They fired, had been firing, despite the debris in the way. Their laser weapons were proportionally
It's not doing
weakened,
anything.
something Spikes was relieved to discover as one of their beams strafed across the deck of his ship and over his second bridge. No damage to anything but the shields, and the shields were holding. He breathed. The laser was smaller. Clearly it was not these weapons batteries that had been destroying the other Venators. And since they were coming at them head-on, he and his men were not being pelted the same way the hapless KDY defenders had been. And then a solid slug moving nearly a quarter the speed of light flew 8 meters past his bridge. It had been larger than a tri-fighter, possibly larger than an arc fighter. "All power to shields! Give them everything for the next 20 seconds. Weapons power, internal lighting, engine strength, life support, everything but the tractor beams!" he called, and not a moment too soon. A second massive shell struck them, this time blasting into the body of the Venator, bouncing off the recently strengthened particle shields in a blinding flash, spinning up and striking the bridge with another flash of light before bouncing away into space. Their fellow Venators did the same and survived the opening salvos that came, one after another.
Barely.
Then the outsider ships stopped firing, now clearly of one mind, ramming. "Steady," Spikes called. The ships were drawing closer, engines leaving trailing plumes of plasma fire in their wake. Those plumes suddenly doubled in intensity as the ships sped up even more. "Shut off all shields, redistribute power, stay steady, troopers!" he yelled, seeing his crew shuffle and tighten their grips on their controls. They did, and the familiar, safe hum of the shields died. It was no matter. As he had already seen, it was a false comfort when dealing with these extreme weapons. Their maneuvers would save them, or nothing would. "Now!" he yelled. At that
Hopefully.
moment, 56 heavy tractor beams, all of which had already been locked onto an enormous slice of the broken dreadnought, swung their emitters in unison. The piece of metal, easily large enough to cover them all, even while scattered, flew through the void on invisible tethers of energy, and stopped abruptly right in front of the charging ships. They attempted to veer, fire engines sputtering and dying as they labored to slow their momentum. But it wouldn't be enough, not nearly enough, not when the next part of the plan kicked in. "Push! Full forward!" Spikes yelled, and the Venators did as ordered, their own sublight trails glowing brightly as their engines flared to full. The momentum of the outsider ships and the sudden countercharge from the massive slab of metal the Venators had put between them was too swift and unexpected a maneuver for the outsider pilots to compensate for, and, one and all, they slammed into the veritable wall of debris. The outsider vessels crumpled somewhat, windows blowing out across the lengths of all 12 ships, and small explosions and balls of fire bursting from the seams and strains.
Still don't think it's
All but
stopping 'em.
one were completely halted, with the single exception having been the only vessel to speed up instead of slow down. Terrifyingly, this ship punched clean through the wreckage, suffering similar damage across itself, and yet not dead or disabled. It plowed directly into the Freedom, a Venator to the right of Spike's own vessel, and he watched from close range as its massive prow nearly cleaved the Star Destroyer in half, annihilating it. By the many moons, one breached the wall! Ignore it for now. Starfighters, stick to the plan. Hit them with everything you've got. Aim for the rents and breaches. Go, go, go! At his command, the Arkwings, Y-Wings, and other attack craft they had launched prior came out of hiding from the debris clouds all around them. The wounded, halted outsider ships were trying to back out of the sudden predicament they had found themselves in. But they were sluggish, stunned, or unable to understand precisely how they were being stopped, as the Venators continued to drive the wall forward, keeping them taut against it. Without a fighter screen to fend them off, the pilots had little trouble finding their marks, using all of their heavy ordnances, launching every last proton torpedo, concussion missile, and area control mine they had. The effect was 11 crippled, dying ships, all falling apart in the void of space. Now there was just one left, but that may have been one too many. Crippled, burning, and firing all the while, the ship's head was still buried in the broken body of the Freedom, firing into the ships to either side with its broadsides. The tempered trooper was rent into pieces with the large shells that had been fired before, having no shields to defend itself with as it aided its fellow Star Destroyers in pushing. The Vermilion Senator activated its shields before the volleys of metal death reached it, but it only survived marginally longer than its sister, the shields taking 2 strikes before collapsing, leaving the ship defenseless as it was filled with more munitions. 5 Star Destroyers remained now, and only for a few more seconds at this rate. "Open fire! All Venators, all turbo lasers, all weapons, fire, fire, fire!" Spikes yelled. His whole ship shook violently as one of the shells pierced its hull, ripping open the hangar to space. But it was too late to worry about damage. All that could be done now was to shoot and shoot and shoot until nothing remained, either of the enemy
Or us.
or of them. And it worked. The ship seemed to stall as, from all sides, the Venators opened fire, covering it in sprays of blue and green turbo lasers as its space frame was pelted with missiles and torpedoes from every ship. Like a salt sculpture, suddenly blasted from all sides with fire hoses, the outsider vessel seemed to simply fall apart and disintegrate under the concentrated firepower. Despite this, not one ship halted or stopped its bombardment until the wedge-shaped head of the enemy had come fully off the rest of its body. The crews cheered, both his and those of the other Venators. 8 on 12 and we still won, said the helmsman. That's the might of the Republic, yelled another. But the sensors operator was not cheering.
Nah.
Sir, we've received transmissions from the General. We're to retreat. Pull back immediately. Sure. As soon as we pull his saber out of this fire. How is the main battle doing? The sensor operator looked sick. The battle is over, sir.
What battle?
Spikes felt his feet go numb, but he didn't show it. Show me, he ordered, and the trooper obeyed. The holotable displayed a sight which made even his heart sink. He had thought
Graveyard.
he'd never be part of a battle as disastrous as those they had fought on Jabim. Not ever again, not this late in the war. But when he saw the graveyard that was all that remained of the vaunted KDY defense fleet, when he saw those massive, ungodly ships prowling in the wake of that burning wreckage like enormous beasts, when he saw them orienting in their direction, Spikes knew he had just become a survivor to a battle that would live in history for as long as the Republic existed, and for all the wrong reasons. Spikes tapped the holotable and brought up holograms of all the remaining captains around him. We need to retreat immediately. We'll rendezvous at Rothana. The Republic needs to know what happened here. Right, we'll dock starships and follow. You should get going, Spikes. I've got room enough for your squadrons, said Captain Touchy. Spikes nodded, remembering the condition of his hangar deck. Don't take too long. It will only take them minutes to be here, Spikes said. The other clones saluted, and he saluted back. Spikes turned then and ordered his helmsman to take them into hyperspace. And it was done in short order. Less than an hour later, he found himself in orbit around Rothana and its massive shipyard rings. Several other survivors of the battle had beaten him here, presumably having fled from the main battle before being taken apart. There were 25 ships there, including his own. General Renfai's flagship, the Honor Hound, was not present. And the 4 other Venators and their crews and captains never made it to the rendezvous.
Yeah, I don't
In
think
fact,
they made it.
they were never heard from again. Captain
That
Spikes
sucks.
waited. He was called to Rothana to provide a report, but he waited. They had been right behind him. He had only gone before them because his hangar had been damaged. Jedi arrived at Rothana from the retreat at Anaxis. They wanted to see him, to hear about how he had defeated 12 of the enemy's ships. But Captain Spikes waited. He sat, legs over the edge of the crew pit stations. He gave no more orders. He had no more orders. But his men stayed with him, and they waited for their brothers who would never come. Eventually the Jedi came to him, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Mace Windu, and Anakin Skywalker. They were saying things, but he couldn't hear them, couldn't see them. He felt a hard hand fall onto his shoulder, and he looked up, only then realizing the moisture that had gathered in his eyes. But even through that, he could make out the face of Anakin Skywalker. The same Anakin who had rescued him from his doomed position on Jabim. "Spikes," he said, and Spikes knew the general remembered him. "We're going to get them back for this," the Jedi told him, metal hand squeezing his shoulder. Somehow, that cold, metal hand conveyed something comforting to the clone. Not compassion, not kindness. The Jedi always had plenty of that. It conveyed understanding. It conveyed a promise. A cold, hard promise. "We will get them for this," the general reasserted. "But we need your help." Spikes nodded and wiped his eyes, transforming his grief, his failure, into rage and conviction. "Yes, General," he said simply, taking his leader's hand and lifting himself. "I'll do whatever it takes."
Man, you guys. Like, how... I don't understand how they can just pull on your heartstrings like that. Dang, guys. I mean, that sucks for Spikes. I mean, to be the only one to have made it back out of all his brothers. God, guys. Why? I mean... I know we have to have a story and all, but dang, why you gotta kill off so many characters and make good guys turn into monsters? because they're trying to repay their brothers. Oh man, guys, that sucks. Now, honestly, I didn't imagine that any of the Warhammer ships would have been destroyed or damaged besides the one that got the hyperspeed jumped on it. Oh, but I mean, that was smart maneuvering on Spike's part. I mean, to hide behind the dreadnought and then to push it as basically a shield between him and the other cruisers coming in. I mean, that was smart. It just sucks that he was the only one to come back. Oh, guys. Oh, so tell me, guys, what did y'all think? I mean, that was a deep episode. I mean, I can definitely see the writing getting better. I mean, we're putting more, I don't want to say effort, but more thought into the backstory and like these characters and the development we're going through. I mean, we were just introduced to Anakin, Obi-Wan, Mace Windu. So I'm curious to see how he's gonna lead, or at least Spikes is going to assist these Jedi and hopefully repaying the Warhammer fleet for destroying everybody. So we'll see what happens on the next one. But with that being said, guys, that's gonna be the end of the video. Like I said before, we have created a Reddit page for you guys, so you can go down and throw video suggestions down for me. So I'll link it down in the description for you guys. And before you head out that door, let's just go ahead and beat up that like and subscribe button. Let's turn notifications on. We're almost at 1,000, guys. We're gonna blow right on past it. We ain't even gonna know what happened, but it would help me out tremendously. So that being said, guys, you have a great rest of your night. Peace, love, happiness to you guys. And always, be easy, guys. Love y'all. Y'all be good.